That collapse loaded the next column, and it fails, and then the next column, and so on, until the entire core is destabilized, and it falls in on itself. When the east penthouse fell downward into the building, you can see sunlight through the windows because the roof was gone. Other windows broke out on the north face at the ends of the building core as the perimeter wall was being damaged. And then it is literally, there's one perimeter, or when the perimeter is left, it is literally pulled down by an 8-story section of the interior that didn't detach during the core collapse. So there's one small part of it that is going at free fall because this thing is yanking it down. And then it goes back to less than free fall. It starts at less than free fall, it ends at less than free fall. For 2.25 seconds, that 8-story core thing is pulling it down. The previous second from the roof line, you see a buckling, and you can kind of look at that as like a long stick that you may have. You can kind of push it down, and it bends, and then crack, and it goes, and then you fall at free fall to the ground.
When a column buckles, the absolute minimum resistance it will give is 25%. There's engineering data on this for many years, many decades. So with the minimum resistance of 25% of the intact column strength, if those columns had a bare minimum of a 2-to-1 factor of safety, which would be absolute minimum, that building could not fall in a natural way at any greater than half the rate of gravity. So the fact that it's falling in free fall means those columns are gone. There is no structural integrity. They cannot happen naturally. There's no chance. And nobody will ever produce a test to show that because that could happen with a structure with any kind of integrity, because it can't happen.
I think the key there, Chris, is that you push it down, you push it down, you push it down. Unfortunately, nothing's pushing up, back up in the case of the of Building 7. The overwhelming force there is not what's coming down. It's the 40,000 tons of structural steel that's 5 times stronger than it needed to be to resist that pushing down. But all of a sudden, the building starts uniformly, symmetrically, there 1 second, and then as we observe, the perimeter structure falls with no resistance. Where did the 40,000 tons of structural steel go? All those columns had to have been cut virtually simultaneously around the perimeter for that building to come down so fast. Take a look here. The building's gaining downward momentum with every second, indicating the force of gravity is unresisted for those 8 stories.
All right, gentlemen, now you've got 1 minute to go back and forth. Richard, again, you've got a minute left if you'd like to continue.
I yield my time.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to suggest that we can come up to the slide here. Once that perimeter does collapse, something amazing happens. You can see it on the slide that's about to come up here. There is no evidence of 4,500 degree thermites or thermates or nanothermites or anything else blowing this face apart. It just kind of buckles over, and you can see it in that picture there. Also, if we go to the next one, from the top, you can see that the whole thing just kind of folds itself over the top. There's a certain amount of integrity that perimeter had. So that's one of the things I want to mention. Also, 5 times maybe the static load, but when you have an active load of gravity pushing things down with the massive amounts of weights that we're talking about with all of these buildings, Richard, it just doesn't work out that way. Can you explain that? I mean,
yeah. How does the active load generate at free fall acceleration with no transition from point 0 to free fall?
It doesn't go that way. It goes slower than free fall, and then it eventually hits free fall, and then it goes slower than free fall again.
Not so. NIST claims there's a slower than free fall, but the building is stationary until all of a sudden it's in full free fall. You can see it in the videos.
All right. Now our next question concerns the molten metal found in the debris pile and FEMA's Appendix C, and it goes to Mr. Gage. Mr. Gage, apparently the structural steel suffered some severe heat and corrosion. Why can't that happen as a result of office fires?
Would you repeat the question, please, Tom?
Yes, I hope I have it right here. Apparently, the structural steel suffered some severe heat and corrosion. Why can't that happen as a result of office fires?
Office fires produce about office fires produce about 1,400 to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. They don't produce the temperatures required to melt steel. And yet, FEMA documents in their Appendix C of the BPAT report that came out in May of 2002, very clear documentation of the melting of steel. So what melted the steel? They, or my opponent, have no explanation for the melting of steel. And the hot sulfur corrosion attack documented by FEMA with intergranular melting. What does that mean? Molten iron is seen documented invading the grain boundaries of the steel. Where did the molten iron come from? There's been no explanation for this from NIST or from my opponent. The molten iron is the byproduct of thermite. Scientists find the signature of thermite in the molten iron. These chunks of steel from Building 7, in fact, the only chunk of steel saved from the illegal destruction of 99% of the evidence, the structural framing of Building 7, they document themselves this hot sulfur corrosion attack. Sulfur doesn't come from this calcium sulfate in the gypsum board. It's an inert bonded ingredient. Gypsum board is designed to protect structural steel. It has never attacked it before. So all of a sudden we have unexplained molten steel and molten iron. We have unexplained chemical evidence of thermate, which is thermite plus added sulfur, which makes a eutectic designed to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. This all remains unexplained, and it is causative of the freefall acceleration of Building 7 down.
Mr. Gage, time up. Now, Chris Mohr for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you. There's some very interesting things to talk about here. First, I just wanted to say that I'm very glad that this is a picture that's about to come up that a lot of people have seen in the movement. It's not being used anymore by Stephen Jones or Richard Gage, to their credit. This was originally used as evidence of molten metal in the debris, and I'm only bringing it up because people need to know that if you think that was evidence, this is actually that molten metal and debris. No, it's actually just a flashlight, which you'll get to see here while I'm talking. There is also that slide of that weird meteorite thing, which I'm going to show you in just a second. It was very, very dense. I think there was probably some sulfidized stuff in there too, and that is really problematic. So the question is, what is that? And just a second here. I'm going the wrong direction. Okay, so this meteorite that is oftentimes used as evidence of some kind of intense temperature and that sort of thing, let's focus in a little bit, and we see scraps of unburned paper crushed into that meteorite. So how does very, very hot thermites or nanothermites or thermates fit in with that? But I think one thing that is very, very important is that FEMA did have a report about sulfidized steel. It remains a mystery. We don't know where that came from. We do know that sulfidized steel can create molten steel at 1,700, 1,800 degrees. We don't know the source of it. It's not accurate to say that it came, as Richard said, and he's right, it's not accurate to say that it came from things like the gypsum. That has been claimed, but it's not true. It's very, very unlikely that it happened there. I will say that it's localized, these pockets of sulfidized steel. It's not universal throughout, and so it doesn't really explain a global process of any kind. And the other thing about the sulfidized steel is that in a way, it's like, yes, there are some things that haven't been fully explained, but that doesn't mean, therefore it must be nanothermites. That's not logical.
Gentlemen, 1 minute.
Well, I'm glad to hear you acknowledge, Chris, that the molten metal, which turns out to be molten iron and steel, is not explainable, that the source of sulfur is not explainable from the building materials in the building. The question remains, what does it explain it? And so, as I suggested in my opener, I think the debate is already over.
I would beg to differ with you, and the reason for that is this assumption that we have. Well, okay, I can go home if you want, but I think I'm having too much fun up here, so I'm going to keep going with this. But this is an example of what I call reverse scientific method right here. We can't explain something; it's a scientific mystery. It must be nanothermites. It must be thermites. that is not a valid conclusion to jump to. There are, first of all, some things can't always be explained, but that doesn't mean that something that, that makes steel melt at 1,400 to 1,800 degrees suddenly becomes evidence of very, very hot nanothermites. I don't get it.
Well, that's 3 items of key specific evidence that are not explainable, that are key points of evidence that NIST chose to ignore, obfuscate, etc. So
thank you, Richard. I am amazed at the length of the sentences that we can come up with at the end of
the
allotted time. I'm having a hard time stepping on it, but to the credit to both of you. Okay, let's continue now. Eyewitness accounts of explosions and also World Trade Center 7. Mr. Gage, you claim that people heard explosions there as well during the collapses and that this indicates controlled demolition. Wouldn't this be happening when the buildings came down?
Well, one wouldn't expect massive explosions inside the building before the fires even got started.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions.
What sort of sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
And the first responder, whistleblower from New York Police Department, Craig Bartmer.
And the whole time you hear thum, 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 thum. So, I think I know an explosion when I hear it.
And Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was a boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something.
And also in the vicinity of World Trade Center 7 in the afternoon, about 5 o'clock, this example.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Chris, are these floors falling in on themselves?
Richard, you've got 20 seconds left. You
yield my time.
Very good.
Okay.
You've got 2 minutes, Richard.
Yeah.
I mean, Chris.
Okay. I also looked at some of your eyewitness accounts, and of course there will be eyewitness accounts of explosions. I know Craig Bartner, who you mentioned you might be talking about, said he heard explosions at the onset of the collapse and not before. One of the challenges that really both of us face when it comes to eyewitness accounts is that unlike the laws of physics, the accounts often change. 6 years after 9/11 and weeks after an email hoax to Dylan Avery about a Building 7 countdown, Kevin McPadden came forth, and you can go on YouTube to see this, to say that, first of all, in his first little speech that I saw on YouTube, the firefighters got a vibe that Building 7 was coming down. There was something he couldn't exactly hear, but it sounded like a countdown. And then in the last few seconds, they just looked at him really weird. Well, that's then later, you have the testimony here, this months later, where the testimony has really changed quite a bit at that point, and has changed much more in favor of a controlled demolition and explosive kinds of things. Barry Jennings said that explosions in Building 7 were before the towers collapsed, and we saw his thing there. The other eyewitness who was physically present with him at the same time, and they went through this hell together, was Michael Hess, who agreed with him at first that the explosions happened ahead of time. And then he said to the BBC that the explosive sounds were tower debris hitting the building later in the day. So he changed his story. So now we have two people with contradictory stories. Tragically, first of all, Jennings got so many phone calls from 9/11 folks that at his job that he was almost fired. When he died, the cause of death was revealed only to his next of kin. Now, in my work, unfortunately, I've had to sit across from over 200 grieving families for funerals. I've seen families where the deceased had post-traumatic stress disorder from war and either drank themselves to death or had a drug overdose or committed suicide, otherwise died in ways that the family didn't want to reveal. Other families have kept the cause of death secret even for a simple heart attack or just to push away public brouhaha in the time of grief. Now, a 9/11 person did hire a private investigator, which honestly I consider to be unethical, and I really would hope that we were careful to respect the wishes of a grieving family in this situation.